What's up, everyone? So today we have this steel hedge trimmer. That's not really important. The important thing is it's a 2-cycle, and we are going to tune it. It's out of tune. We just did some work on it, but this could be for any type of tuning. Maybe you moved, or it's getting a little older, whatever. If you need to tune a 2-cycle because it's not running very well, then let's go ahead and talk about it. So first things first, how do you tune it? So on a carburetor, there's going to be two majority styles, one with a low and a high. How do you know which one's a low and a high? Sometimes in the carb you can see it. If you're like me, where you can't see it because it's covered up by this piece of plastic, the low is always the one closest to the motor, and high is the furthest one out. Pretty easy. Now if you have one that's only one, then that's even easier. You just have to use one screw, and that's what we're doing. We are turning in these adjustment screws. If you tighten it, it lessens the fuel, or it restricts the fuel. If you loosen it, it allows more fuel to go in. So there's two terms that we need to pay attention to: lean and rich. Lean is when there's not enough fuel. Rich is when there's too much. Pretty simple. Things are always going to be easier if you have it rich to begin with. It will usually run rich. And how do you know it's rich? There's usually smoke coming out of the muffler. You can hear it bog almost. It can also bog when it's lean, but usually it just dies. So if you're having a situation where you're getting a lot of smoke, you're either too rich, or maybe your mixture's off. But if you need to tune it, then let's go ahead and do that. Next thing you need to do is get your tools ready. Majority of the idle screw is going to be just a normal Phillips head screwdriver. However, they decided to make this a little hard for us in the actual needles themselves. If you go to Amazon or Google or eBay or whatever and type in 2-cycle adjustment drivers, you're going to get a pack. There's usually like 8 or 10 of them in there. They're usually pretty cheap, and they'll come with some large ones, some small ones. You need to look inside your carburetor and see which one you have. For reference, I'm using a hexagon. Almost all steels use this. It's just a little hexagon on the end of it. And that's pretty much all the tools that you need. So let me explain how I'm going to do this. So what I'm going to be doing first is I'm going to run the idle up, because it's usually easier to have the engine speed higher and then lower it back down. Now, when you do this, you need to, well, in my practice, what I end up doing is I usually end up trying to get the high pretty good. And what I'm going to do is I usually, if it's running pretty good already, I will richen it up until it starts to bog or starts puffing out blue smoke, and once it does, I lean it back out until the RPMs get really fast. And then once you start turning it a little bit too much, you'll hear them start to decline again. You went too far. Once you start to hear the RPMs decline, tightening or leaning it out, you need to go back the other direction to richen it up, where the RPMs are screaming again, and then a little bit more richening until the RPMs are lowering again, but not that much, just a little bit. It's better to have these run a little rich than a little lean, or at their full maximum speed, because that can just be dangerous. You don't really want to do that. And once I get that done, I will go towards the idle. More likely than not, it's going to die, so that's going to be the more frustrating part, but I'll explain that once we get it going. So stay tuned till the end. I'll explain the idle. Put in the idle adjustment screw. In this machine, I think we actually have a problem with the clutch, but because I'm literally, usually when you do the idle, you end up having to go, and if it's a weed eater, until the head stops spinning. If it's a chainsaw, until the chain stops moving. On this case, it's the hedge trimmer, but I don't believe the clutch is actually working as it should, because right now it's pretty low. It shouldn't be that low. So what I'm going to do right now is I'm going to get it working as best as I can, and then I'm going to go ahead and bring it back and explain what exactly occurred. Actually, no, I think let's watch. Let's just do this again. Seems pretty good to me. I might do a little fine tuning later. And that's another thing. You're going to need to do fine tuning. There's really no better way to tune this than to actually use it. So cut something, go weed eating, whatever you're using, cut a tree, I know, whatever. Idle. What did I do? I cranked the idle speed up. More likely than not, it's going to be rich. Ideally, it should be. If you're having a hard time even keeping it at idle, try riching it up. It will usually run rich, but do it in small increments. What I will usually do, at least for the idle, the machine sometimes will actually tell you on the side what it should be set at. If it's not there, turn the screw all the way in and do one turn. And then if that doesn't work, 1 1/4. If that doesn't work, 1 1/2. If it's completely off, maybe go back the other direction and try a 1/2 turn, and then 3/4. One of them should work. If none of those work, you could go all the way up to 2 turns, but you're getting to the territory of there might be engine problems, which is something else to discuss later. Once it's idling, excuse me, I will then lean it out, because you can kind of tell there was a little bit of smoke coming out of it in the beginning. I'm leaning it out. Usually when leaning it out, if it gets smoother, it means it's rich. If it's still really choppy and you're leaning it out and it's about to die, then it was too lean and you need to go the opposite direction. I had it too rich set originally, and it was really choppy, so I leaned it out, and you heard the RPMs get a lot better. I then took my screwdriver and lowered the RPMs even more. And then once I get to the point where I liked the engine speed, it was still a little choppy. I then went back and leaned it out until it got really, really smooth. And then once it got to pretty much the same point as the high, where the highest RPM range where you're going to be able to really notice, I then richened it up a little bit more until this RPM started to drop. And that's it. At that moment in time, rev it up. If it bogs down, like it dies, go ahead and richen up the low first and give that a try. If that's not working at all, then you're going to want to richen up the high. So I would definitely try richening up the low first, and then richen up the high. You should have a very smooth acceleration. Let me show you. I'm going to try to mimic the bad acceleration and then do the normal one. You see how it, in the beginning, it's not a good imitation. It's really hard because it's properly tuned. But if it is having a hard time getting up to speed relatively quickly, then go back to the low, richen it up, and then go back to the high, give that a try, and just kind of go back and forth. And that's the thing. These are going to go back, they kind of feed off each other. So once you get one ready, if you richen one up, you might have to lean the other one out. If you lean one out, you might have to richen the other one. It's kind of like a little game that likes to play with you. But personally, I start with a high, and then I work down to my idle. Once the idle is set, then I'll go back to high and do the fine tuning. I didn't see a need to do the fine tuning on this one because it revved up perfect. There's no smoke, and it seemed like it had plenty of power. It wasn't screaming, so I didn't really have to adjust the high. You rarely do once you get the idle set, and if you have already done the high, you can start with the idle. There are situations I will do that. Maybe you're having a hard time revving up to begin with. Go ahead and start with the idle. Get the idle nice and smooth, and then later, with your finger on the throttle, kind of feather it. Put your driver in and richen and lean it out and see which way it gets better. If every time you press down on the throttle and it just gets worse, then go the opposite direction, and then it should get better. And once you get to the point where you're actually able to rev it up, smooth it out, go to the point I told you, then richen it up like I said, and then go back to idle. Make sure everything is nice and smooth, make sure it's not choppy, and if it isn't, you're set. So, couple things to go over. This machine was already warm. I know it's going to be a little hard, but if your machine is not warm, your tune is not going to be right. So you potentially might have to tune it just to get it running, and then once it's fully warmed up, tune it some more. That's completely normal. Don't be alarmed. Just go ahead, and that's just the process. Another thing, if you find it is just not tuning at all, and this is a telltale sign of like a seal problem or some type of vacuum leak at least, if you get to a point where it's like pretty good and all of a sudden it goes really high and then really low, really high and then really low, that's usually a sign of a seal or, like I said, some type of vacuum leak. If you are unable to tune that out, then stop, reevaluate. Majority of the time it's a crankcase seal. Go down that avenue to replace it and then tune it. You can't out-tune a vacuum leak, you really can't, so don't bother. You're just going to drive yourself insane. Next, you're going to want to tune it generally in the area that you're going to be using it and the weather you're going to be using it. Weather doesn't really change it all that much, but it can. So keep that in mind. Another thing, when you tune it, it should be properly maintained. You shouldn't be tuning this with a dirty air filter, bad spark plug, nasty fuel. You have good fuel with good oil, newer or at least clean spark plug, and newer or at least clean air filter. If you tune it with bad maintenance habits already on it, you're just going to set yourself up for failure. Don't do that. Another thing, make sure your choke is off. You will be surprised how many times someone brings it to me because they've replaced the carb or cleaned it and they were trying to tune it and it was just completely jacked up. Like they twisted all those adjustment screws all the way in and it's still rich, still not working. And turns out choke was on. So keep an eye on the choke, make sure it's properly maintained, make sure it's warm, and then you should be fine. Recap. You can start either on high or the low, depending on your situation. But if you're able to, I prefer to start high. Get it to the highest RPM range you can, richen it up. Go to idle. Put the idle screw in a little bit more than it should, so at least it's running. And then at that point, start to lean it out, richen it up. Lean it out, richen it up. It's here where the RPMs go. You want it to go to the really high RPM and then richen it up a little bit so it dips down a little bit lower on the idle as well. Then take your screwdriver, lower that idle. Once the idle is at the point where you kind of like it, if it's still a little choppy, do this exact same thing. Richen it up, lean it out. Richen it up, lean it out until it's nice and smooth. And then go to your high one last time. Make sure it's good to go. If it needs a little adjustment, go ahead and adjust it. Finally, go use it. See what you need to do. If you need to adjust it, the convenient part about it is these are really small. They just happen to be pocket size. So carry this with you and do some on-site adjustment and you'll be fine. This is good for weed eaters, weed eaters, hedge trimmers, anything 2-cycle. The only real exception is a chainsaw. A chainsaw you should almost exclusively tune it to perfection under a load. Because you can get it tuned up very well on your table, but then as soon as you go to cut wood, it might be underpowered. So definitely be prepared on a chainsaw to do some final adjustments. If this wasn't having a clutch problem, then we would basically be setting the idle to where, like I said, if it's a chainsaw, the chain isn't moving. If it's a weed eater, the head isn't moving. It might barely move, like every now and then might twitch. That's okay. You could potentially go lower. Doesn't really matter. It's just up to you. I kind of like it where it doesn't twitch, but that's just me. And other than that, you have successfully tuned a 2-cycle. If you have any questions on how to tune one, then definitely leave a comment below. Subscribe. Follow me on Instagram at SmallEngine101. If this has helped you out, leave a comment of what you tuned and what you plan on doing with it. And then don't forget, if it did help you out, put a thumbs up because that definitely helps me out. And I'll catch you on the next one. You have a good night.